Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal nocturnal animals in an interwoven story of love and revenge. Art dealer Susan Moreau, played by Amy Adams, receives a proof of a novel called Nocturnal Animals, written by her ex-husband Edward Sheffield, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, who she has not seen in 19 years after she left him in bad circumstances, but has dedicated the book to her. As she reads it, a violent Texas-set crime tale, she begins to reassess her life and her relationship with Edward, all the while growing concerned that his story is a metaphor for their time together and may serve as its revenge. Nocturnal Animals is based off the 1993 book by Austin Wright, Tony and Susan, that when it was first published didn't garner that much attention, but that all changed in 2010 when it was republished and reappraised, hence this film version. And it's the second movie directed by Tom Ford, who's best known as a fashion designer, but has previously directed films before. He helmed the critically acclaimed gay drama A Single Man, starring Colin Firth, that was this very stylish and elegant piece. Although, when I remember seeing that movie quite a few years ago now, I did think those qualities actually kept me away from the drama. For a second film though, Ford has picked something wildly different to his debut. Yes, it's still very stylish, as you would expect from his background, but it's also considerably more expansive and ambitious, and he's chosen to cover a story that has not one, not two, but three different timelines running in parallel and all feeding off of each other. And that's a very complicated piece of work for a director to take on, especially for someone who hasn't necessarily come from a film background like Ford has. What Ford does have, though, is a very particular eye for detail, and that is the main quality of Nocturnal Animals. And what really comes across in Ford's direction here is that he's very fixated on the psychology of the mind. You could see this to a certain extent in A Single Man, but it really comes to fruition here, because when you combine that with the thriller elements, there is definitely a feeling that's reminiscent of the work of Alfred Hitchcock, who was again very fixated on the violence of the mind. A lot of this movie is very fixated on the internal thoughts of its lead character, Susan. We first meet Amy Adams as Susan in LA, and on the surface it appears like she's a very successful person. She's got this huge home, she's got this high-powered art dealership job, she seems like she's quite wealthy, and she's got this handsome husband played by Armie, but it becomes very clear that Susan is desperately unhappy, and the cracks in that world are all too apparent, as reiterated by the cold tones that Ford uses for this particular part of the movie. And it's clear that they're actually having money troubles, and that husband is actually cheating on her, and they're emotionally distant from each other. And that home is actually more of a glass mausoleum. It feels incredibly isolating, especially since Adams spends so much of the movie alone in that house. And there's this idea that the LA world that she inhabits, specifically the art world, is all an illusion. It's not the real world. It's all based on fakery and perspective and trying to fool people. This idea is taken to its real extreme in the opening credit sequence, which I'll give it points for. It is certainly audacious, and I don't want to give it away because the entire point of it is the shock value of it, because it's the very first thing that you see, and it has this very clear commentary that the American dream has been distorted, and it's grotesque, and it's actually very toxic in its own way. But there's also ideas of beauty that can be read in this particular sequence, and especially ideas of self-worth, because it becomes clear that Susan is watching what we're seeing as part of an art exhibition. And you could channel those into her own ideas of what her soul may be like in her own mind and her own feelings of guilt. There's a lot of ways that you could read that particular sequence, and it's this very surreal moment. But I do have to admit that it might be a little bit of a misstep, because it doesn't really truly represent the tone of the movie. If you're sort of put out by that opening credit sequence, please stick with the movie. It's not all like that. What it also establishes is this idea of cruelty, not just on the audience, but also of the performers in that scene. It does feel like it's being very cruel to them. And this idea of cruelty that lingers in the mind is something that keeps going through the movie time and time again. And it's already established that Susan's mind is very delicate. It seems like she might have had problems before the movie started, and she's already trying to reassess her life. And it seems like she's lived her life making decisions that have costed her a great deal on an emotional level. And they really do a good job here of making Adam seem very cold, especially, I think, because of the choice of these huge block reading glasses that she uses in these scenes, that make her seem quite formidable and cut off, but even her skin tone seems a little bit icy. She often wears this very heavy eyeliner that's matched with the fact that the character is often very tired. The title Nocturnal Animals is not only the book that Edward's written for her, but it comes from his nickname for her, because she spends her nights awake because she can't rest her mind, and she spends most of the movie reading Edward's novel at night. It almost becomes like this lingering nightmare. This second timeline easily takes up 3/5 of the movie. It's definitely its main focus, this novel within the film that Edward, her ex-husband, has written. And we see it as Susan reads it through and imagines it in her head. And she imagines the main character, Tony, as a clear author surrogates for Edward, so Jake Gyllenhaal is playing both parts. Tony is this family man, he has a teenage daughter and he has a red-headed wife, but instead of getting Amy Adams to play that character, they've got Isla Fisher, someone who is clearly not quite Susan, but we're definitely supposed to make the connection, and that's very smart. It shows just how clever and how very, in some ways, meta this movie is in certain regards with its main conceit. It tells this incredibly violent Texas-set tale of neo-noirish revenge, where this family are confronted by these group of Texas rednecks led by a sadistic Aaron Taylor Johnson, and he attacks them, and Tony has to take revenge on them. He tries to seek out those that have taken on this crime. It's a very obvious revenge tale, but it's nestled inside this other tale of revenge that's much less obvious, and it feels very much like a release of that masculine id, that very aggressive side of him, and that becomes increasingly menacing as the movie goes along. But it really says something about Ford's direction in that this particular storyline, I could have easily taken it as a movie by itself, in that it could very much stand on its own 2 feet as this very gripping piece of work. The scene where the family is first confronted by this gang driving on this nighttime Texas road in the middle of nowhere, it's a genuinely suspenseful and nerve-wracking sequence. It is terrifying. While we're drawn into this story, especially because it feels so real to Susan, what she's actually done is traded a false reality, this bubble that she has in LA, for a different false reality, because it's hyper-realist. Everything is overly exaggerated, and you can see that in the characterizations, in that everyone is a little bit overcooked, in that it's meant to be just a little bit over the top in certain regards, and it feels very brightly coloured and tactile and very gritty in comparison to the cold, sterile world that Susan inhabits. And it's such a gripping piece of cinema. It's almost reminiscent of something that Cormac McCarthy would write, in just how brutal it is. And make no mistake, this is a very, very brutal movie, and as the story plays out, it gets more and more disturbing especially when you consider the sort of psychological implications. And this commentary is enhanced by the third timeline in the film, these flashbacks to Susan and Edward's relationship, and we first see their meet cute, and it's incredibly romantic. It's this wintry, snowy New York day, and it's two people that used to know each other that just happen to reconnect. It feels like it was destined to be. And Ford does this thing with his cinematography in that he intentionally amplifies the isolation of the characters by putting them in these quite stark, empty landscapes, like Tony just standing in the vast expanse of the desert, or Susan inside her glass-walled home, or walking up this vast staircase. It all emphasises how desperate they are for connection. But when they are together, Ford emphasises that by deliberately pushing the camera in very close, being very intimate with each other, that it feels like their world is complete at those particular moments. And there's definitely a marked difference between Gyllenhaal and especially Adams' performance in these past scenes than they have in the other parts of the movie, where they feel very young and positive and idealistic. Adams' particular seems a lot more effervescent in the past scenes than she does in the present scenes, where she's turned into this quite cold and hardened figure. But the seed of that cynicism is still there in the past, and that is what ultimately destroys their relationship. There's this definite idea of the idea that time changes people, that it hardens us in some way, and that we start out as trying to make our own mark in the world, although Susan feels like she's not really able to do that. She's purely critical and analytical, whereas Edward is the more creative person in the relationship. But the feeling is that she starts out that way, and there's this fractured relationship with her mother, played by Linney, and she dismissively refers to her parents as homophobic Republicans. But it's clear from Linney's one scene, and it is a fantastic scene, that she's a far more complicated person than that has had to make a number of her own compromises, and in some ways knows where Susan has been before. Ultimately, the movie is this cautionary tale that Ford is telling about love itself and how one should take care of it and should treasure it, because you never know when you'll get it again. And Susan is quite cruel with her love. She doesn't treat Edward very well, and that eventually hardens them both. And you can see that as Edward's writing progresses, and there's this real bitterness and spite that courses as an undercurrent throughout it, and it feels that way throughout Nocturnal Animals as well, the film, in that there is something quite bracing about just how nasty it can be. The acting in this film is fantastic. I mentioned before that Gyllenhaal and Adams have these parts that have this huge dramatic range across the running time, and even from scene to scene. They are essentially the pillars that hold up the structure of this movie across its various different timelines. And while I do admit that there are parts of this movie where it is essentially Amy Adams reading, and it feels like she hasn't got much to do in those sections, I do think I was probably spoiled to a certain extent because of just how centre stage she is in Arrival coming into this movie. Because there are sections that purely depend on just how emotive Adams's face is. But the thing is, she works well for that purpose, because while the character is coarsened in some respects, she's still empathetic, and I think a lot of that comes from just how emotive Amy Adams is as an actress. This is a part that really shows her versatility. When the film focuses on her character, it shows just how different of a performer she can be. And Gyllenhaal's performance is equally committed and intense, and it very much sees with anger and frustration that's not just aimed at Susan, but also at himself, because the character of Tony is very much a representation of Edward as a person and how he feels quite critical about the way that he acted in their relationship as well. If I did have a criticism of Gyllenhaal's performance in this movie, it's that exaggerated portion of the novel within the film does occasionally make Gyllenhaal maybe become a little bit too reliant on his tick of shouting. He very much gets a lot of scenes of screaming that he seems to have just developed over the last couple of movies, but here he does have a lot of very emphatic scenes of him dropping to his knees and yelling out in the air. But the two performances that really steal the show in this film, Michael Shannon and Aaron Taylor-Johnson, who are both in the novel in the film section of it. Shannon plays the sheriff who is helping Tony out in trying to solve his case. He plays this heightened character. He's this classic embodiment of a Texan sheriff, right down to the big hat and everything. And he's essentially this one-man law unto himself. He's not afraid of bending the law for his own purposes. And he is essentially the moral compass to Tony in the story that gradually becomes corrupted and tries to provoke him into taking a course of pure active revenge, not justice, but revenge. And it's such a powerful presence in the movie. Shannon is one of our finest actors at the moment, and he cuts an intimidating, menacing, but also empathetic figure. There is a certain amount of vulnerability to this character, especially later in the movie. It's a really fantastic performance that very much knows exactly what he's playing in this particular portion of the movie. And Aaron Taylor-Johnson, he is a revelation in this movie. He is truly frightening in this film. He goes all out. He really gets under your skin. Considering that Taylor-Johnson has sometimes given performances that are a little bit lackluster, this performance is truly transformative, but it's so wildly different to what he's played before. If you're thinking of Kick-Ass in this movie, you can scrub that from your mind the first time he's on screen. He is a legitimately terrifying presence in this movie. And the supporting cast is very starry and eclectic. I wouldn't be surprised if many of them did this movie as a favour to Ford, because they only have a few minutes of screen time each and they only appear in maybe one or two scenes, but they make long-lasting impressions. So you'll have a scene where suddenly Michael Sheen, suddenly you'll have Andrea Riseborough, suddenly you'll have the aforementioned fantastic turn by Laura Linney, and you'll have Jena Malone or Armie Hammer. They all add to the movie in a certain way. And I mentioned before that Ford is very focused, and that really benefits the movie because it's quite neat in its execution in the way that it's edited and directed, and the scenes blend together very well. He manages to cut across various different timelines with increasing confidence and verve. And it's clear that he structured the movie so that there are definitely moments and key lines that reverberate across the entire movie, and you can clearly see the callbacks, but at the same time it's definitely something that would benefit from repeated viewings, because you would certainly reappraise elements of Nocturnal Animals, the novel within the film, after knowledge of later revelations from the first viewing. And certainly to build up your own analysis of what the film is like, because this is a movie that is very complicated and has so many different opportunities for reading, because on the one hand, yes, it is this highbrow art house drama, but on the other hand, it's this pulpy thriller, and the two manage to merge together surprisingly well, and they enrich each other. Overall, though, Nocturnal Animals is definitely one of the year's most involving and intriguing films, and definitely one that's going to provoke lots and lots of post-film discussion, because there's so much to discuss. I think on a certain level it will divide audiences because of just the sheer scope of what it tries to accomplish, but even still, even if you consider this a movie as being stark style over substance, and I don't think it is. I think there's plenty of substance to be had here, even as an exercise in just pure style, in pure cinema language, as a pure exercise of storytelling. I think Nocturnal Animals is definitely something that you'll almost certainly be chewing on for a very long time. Nocturnal Animals is a haunting and expertly crafted look at the responsibility of love and how it changes and affects us. Playing in 3 different strands, it says something about how engaging Ford's direction is that the novel within the film could easily stand by itself as an effective and vicious thriller in its own right, but it's enriched by the nested narrative that gives it added meaning, even if the real life scenes don't work as independently. The film's phenomenal cast is brilliant with a host of excellent performances, including scene-stealing work from Michael Shannon and Aaron Taylor-Johnson, and recognisable faces in small but key parts, with Adams and Gyllenhaal serving as anchors. It's a cruelly beautiful work of great ambition and style that's one of the year's most interesting films. Coming up soon, we meet a real nocturnal animal in a street cat named Bob. Ken Loach looks at poverty, benefits and hardship in I, Daniel Blake, and the love story that shook a United Kingdom. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.